The water hit the floor first. Then it hit the CEO's shoes. Jin-woo Park froze mid-sentence, his voice cutting off in front of 40 investors and every senior executive at Han Global Technologies. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his $3,000 Italian leather shoes, then looked up at the old man holding the mop. His face went red before anyone in the room could even process what had happened. "You clumsy old fool," Jin-woo snapped, his voice slicing through the marble lobby. "Do you have any idea what these shoes cost? More than you'll make in a year." The old man said nothing. He simply reached for a cloth to wipe the floor, his hands steady despite the sudden silence pressing in from every direction. That silence didn't last. "I'm talking to you," Jin-woo said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over the janitor's bent frame. "Look at me when I'm speaking." The old man rose slowly. He met Jin-woo's eyes without fear, without apology, and that composure only made the young CEO angrier. "People like you are replaceable," Jin-woo continued, loud enough for the investors near the elevator to hear every word. "I could fire you right now and have someone new mopping this floor in 20 minutes. You understand that? You're nothing here. Nothing." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone in that lobby understood the unwritten rule of Han Global Technologies. Cross Jin-woo Park, and your career ends before lunch. Everyone except one woman. Sarah Johnson set down the folder she was carrying, walked past 3 vice presidents who refused to make eye contact, and stood directly between Jin-woo and the janitor. "That's enough," she said. Jin-woo blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me?" "I said that's enough," Sarah repeated, her voice calm but unshakable. "He didn't do anything to deserve this." What nobody in that room knew, not Jin-woo, not the investors, not even Sarah herself, was that the janitor standing behind her, the one being humiliated in front of half the company, owned every single brick of the building they were standing in. To understand how they got to this moment, you have to go back 1 week. Han Global Technologies sat at the center of Seoul's financial district, a glass tower that seemed to catch fire every sunrise. Inside, the company's motto was engraved into the lobby wall in gold lettering 4 feet tall: "Humanity First." Employees walked past it every morning without looking up. New hires photographed it for their social media. Investors mentioned it in every pitch deck. Nobody, it seemed, actually lived by it. Min-ho Park built this company from a small electronics repair shop 40 years earlier. He was 73 years old now, still sharp, still sitting on the board, though he had handed daily operations to his nephew, Jin-woo, 2 years prior. Lately, something had been eating at him. Reports crossed his desk about employee turnover, about anonymous complaints filed and quietly buried, about a culture that had curdled somewhere beneath the polished surface of quarterly earnings calls. He didn't trust what his executives told him anymore. Every report was filtered, softened, spun to make the numbers look good and the leadership look better. So Min-ho did something nobody expected. He told his driver he was taking a 2-week vacation to Jeju Island. Instead, he cut his hair short, put on the plainest clothes he owned, and applied for a night shift janitorial position at his own company under the name Min-ho Kim, using an old identity from decades before his name became recognizable. Nobody in human resources looked twice at the application. Nobody in the building recognized the founder in wrinkled work clothes, pushing a cleaning cart through hallways he designed himself. For 3 days, he watched. He watched executives step over spilled coffee without acknowledging the person cleaning it up. He watched managers speak to interns like they were furniture. He watched a woman in accounting scream at a delivery worker over a mislabeled package, then walk into a meeting and give a passionate speech about compassionate leadership 20 minutes later. He watched people who wore the company's values like a costume, discarding them the moment nobody important was watching. And then he watched Sarah Johnson. She was a senior operations executive, one of the highest-ranking Americans at Han Global Technologies, brought in 3 years earlier to help the company expand into North American markets. She had a reputation inside the building. Sharp, demanding in meetings, unyielding on deadlines. But Minho noticed something the reports never mentioned. She said good morning to the security guard by name every single day. She remembered which cafeteria worker had a daughter starting college. She held elevator doors. She never once looked through the people who kept the building running, the way so many others did. On his second night, Minho was struggling to move a heavy supply cart stuck against a door frame. Sarah was working late, reviewing budget projections in a nearby conference room. She noticed him through the glass, walked out, and without a word, helped him lift the cart free. "Thank you," Minho said, genuinely surprised. "Of course," Sarah replied, brushing dust off her sleeve like it was nothing. "You've been working non-stop tonight. Have you eaten?" Minho hesitated. Nobody had asked him that question in 3 days. "Not yet. There's leftover catering in the break room from this afternoon's meeting. Sandwiches, some fruit. Help yourself. Nobody's going to touch it otherwise, and it'll just get thrown out." "I couldn't," he said out of habit, though the hunger in his stomach argued otherwise. "You could," Sarah said, smiling. "I insist. Food shouldn't go to waste while people go hungry in the same building." She walked him to the break room herself, made him a cup of coffee, and sat with him for 10 minutes while he ate, asking about his family, his health, whether the night shifts were too hard on him. She didn't ask because it was polite. She asked because she wanted to know. Minho watched her carefully that night, the way a man studies something he's trying to memorize. He thought about the executives filing into his boardroom every Monday, reciting numbers and strategies, never once mentioning the people who made those numbers possible. He thought about his own son, gone 8 years now, who used to tell him that a company's soul lived in how it treated the people nobody was watching. Minho hadn't listened closely enough back then. He was listening now. If this story is pulling you in already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tap the like icon. It helps more stories like this one reach you. And there's a lot more waiting just ahead. By the 4th day, Minho had learned everyone's name in the executive wing. He'd learned Jinwoo's too, though not through introduction. Jinwoo never spoke directly to the janitorial staff. He spoke past them, over them, around them, as though speaking to a piece of cleaning equipment might lower his own status. Jinwoo Park was 34 years old, sharp-featured, always dressed like he was about to walk into a magazine shoot. He'd been groomed for leadership since childhood, sent to the best schools in Seoul and then Wharton, taught that confidence was the only currency that mattered in a boardroom. Compassion to him was a weakness dressed up as a virtue. He believed that softness at the top created chaos at the bottom, and he ran every department with that philosophy stitched into his decisions. He liked Sarah's numbers. He respected her results. But he didn't respect her, not really. And that tension had been simmering under the surface of every meeting they'd shared for the last year. It finally cracked open on a Tuesday morning. The executive team gathered in the top-floor boardroom for the quarterly strategy meeting, the kind of meeting where careers quietly rose or quietly ended depending on who spoke and who stayed silent. Sarah had prepared a proposal for weeks, an employee wellness initiative aimed at reducing the company's rising turnover rate, especially among support staff and junior employees. She had data. She had projections. She had case studies from 3 competitor companies where similar programs had cut attrition by nearly 20%. She stood at the front of the room and presented it clearly, confidently, the way she presented everything. Jinwoo let her finish before he spoke. "This is cute," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But we're not running a charity, Sarah. We're running a technology company that answers to shareholders." A few quiet laughs rippled around the table. Sarah didn't flinch. "The data shows this isn't charity, Jinwoo. It's retention. Every employee we lose costs us an average of $40,000 in recruitment and training. A wellness program that keeps people here for even one additional year would save the company millions annually. Or, Jinwoo said, we could just replace unhappy employees with people who are grateful to have a job at all. There's no shortage of applicants. That mindset is exactly why our turnover is climbing, Sarah replied, her voice steady but firm. People aren't disposable inventory. Treat them that way, and eventually the ones worth keeping will leave too. Jinwoo's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged in front of the room, especially not by someone who wasn't Korean, wasn't a Park, wasn't part of the bloodline that had built this company. Something about her confidence in that moment lit a fuse in him he didn't bother hiding. "You're being emotional," he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "This is a business, not a support group. I'd expect someone in your position to understand the difference." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something crossed a line, but nobody has the courage to say so. Sarah held his gaze. "I understand the difference perfectly well, Jinwoo. What concerns me is that you don't seem to understand that people are the business. Without them, there is no company left to run." Jinwoo ended the meeting there, cutting the agenda short, his mood souring the rest of the executive floor for the remainder of the day. Word of the exchange spread through the building by lunchtime, whispered in hallways and elevators. Some admired Sarah for standing her ground. Most simply felt relief that it hadn't been them in that chair. Minho, pushing his cart past the boardroom that morning, had heard every word through the door left slightly ajar. He said nothing. He simply kept moving, filing the conversation away with everything else he'd been collecting that week. 3 days later, Han Global Technologies hosted its largest event of the year. An investor gala celebrating the company's 20th anniversary, held in the same glass lobby where the gold lettering spelled out humanity first for anyone willing to look up. Executives mingled with investors from Tokyo, Singapore, and New York. Champagne circulated on silver trays. A string quartet played near the entrance. Photographers moved through the crowd, capturing images destined for the company's annual report. Minho worked that night too, though not in his usual uniform. As founder, tradition required his presence at the gala, so he'd planned to slip away from his janitorial duties for exactly 1 hour, change into a suit in a service closet, make a brief appearance among the investors as an old family friend visiting from abroad, and then disappear again before anyone asked too many questions. It was risky. It was also, he decided, worth it, if only to see how the night unfolded from both sides of the room. But before he could execute the switch, a spill near the champagne station needed immediate attention, and none of the other night staff were available. Minho, still in his work uniform, grabbed a mop and moved quickly to clean it before any of the guests slipped. That was when Jinwoo, mid-conversation with a group of investors from a Tokyo-based venture fund, turned and nearly collided with him. The water from Minho's bucket splashed against Jinwoo's shoes. Everything Sarah walked into moments later, the humiliation, the shouting, the crowd of onlookers too afraid to intervene, had been building toward that exact instant for the entire week. "You clumsy old fool," Jinwoo had said, and the room had gone still around them. Sarah stepped between them without a second of hesitation. "That's enough," she said. "Excuse me?" Jinwoo repeated, incredulous that anyone, let alone her, would interrupt him in front of investors. "I said that's enough," Sarah said again, louder this time, making sure every person near them heard it clearly. "He didn't do anything to deserve this kind of treatment. It was an accident." Jinwoo's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't concern you, Sarah. Stay out of it." "It concerns everyone in this room," Sarah shot back. "You're screaming at an elderly man in front of investors because a little water touched your shoes. Do you understand how that looks?" "I don't care how it looks. I care about respect. And right now, this man owes me an apology. No, Sarah said, her voice cutting clean through the tension. You owe him one. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A few investors exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to keep watching or pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. Jinwoo stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that his voice dropped to something colder, quieter, more dangerous than shouting. You're forgetting your place. I run this company, not you. And this man deserves basic human dignity, Sarah replied, refusing to back down even an inch. That's not something you get to overrule, Jinwoo, no matter what title is on your business card. For a long moment, nobody moved. Minho stood frozen behind Sarah, watching the woman who had shared her dinner with him 3 nights earlier now risking everything she'd built to defend him in front of the most important people in the company's orbit. You have 30 seconds to walk away, Jinwoo said, his voice trembling now with barely restrained fury, or I promise you there will be consequences. Sarah didn't move. The way we treat people who can't benefit us, she said slowly, deliberately, loud enough for the entire room to hear, reveals exactly who we are. And right now, everyone here is watching who you really are, Jinwoo. The silence that followed felt like it lasted a full minute, though it couldn't have been more than 5 seconds. Jinwoo's face went through several colors, red, then pale, then a controlled, furious white. You're suspended, he said finally. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. A murmur ran through the crowd. 2 security guards, who had been standing near the entrance the entire time, exchanged uneasy glances before slowly approaching. Are you serious? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Dead serious, Jinwoo said, and take your new friend with you. The guards escorted both Sarah and Minho out through the glass doors, past a lobby full of investors who had stopped pretending not to watch, past photographers who lowered their cameras out of some final flicker of decency, and out onto the cold sidewalk beneath the company's illuminated logo. Neither of them spoke until they reached the corner. You didn't have to do that, Minho finally said, his voice quiet. Yes, I did, Sarah replied without hesitation. You just lost your job, maybe your entire career at this company, over a janitor. Sarah turned to face him fully, and there was something in her expression. Not regret, not doubt, just quiet conviction. You're not just a janitor, you're a person. And what he did in there was wrong, no matter who you are or what your job title says. Why does it matter so much to you? Minho pressed. Most people in that room stayed silent. Most people would have stayed silent. Sarah exhaled, watching her breath fog in the cool night air. My parents raised me to believe that character shows up in the small moments, not the big ones. Anybody can be kind when it costs them nothing. The real test is whether you're still kind when it costs you everything. She paused. My mother used to say that success without humanity isn't really success at all. It's just decoration. Minho studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Sarah said softly. She passed 2 years ago, but I think about her every single day, especially in moments like tonight. They stood there a while longer, the city moving around them, taxis honking somewhere in the distance, the glass tower glowing behind them like nothing inside it had just fractured. Thank you, Minho finally said, for what you did in there. Nobody has ever done something like that for me. You didn't deserve what happened to you, Sarah said simply. Nobody does. Minho nodded slowly, then said something that would replay in Sarah's mind for weeks afterward. I hope you know that what you did tonight will matter more than you think. Sarah gave a tired smile, assuming it was simply an old man's kindness in return for her own. I hope so too. Right now, though, I think I just need to figure out how I'm going to explain this to my landlord if I don't have a paycheck next month. Minho almost smiled at that, though he caught himself before it showed. Get some rest, he said. Things have a way of resolving themselves. Sarah went home that night, certain her career at Han Global Technologies was finished. She replayed the confrontation over and over in her apartment, wondering if she'd made the right choice, wondering if principal was worth the price she was about to pay. But underneath the anxiety sat something steadier, a quiet certainty that she would make the same choice again if given the chance. Her mother's voice echoed in the back of her mind. Character shows up in the moments that cost you something. She didn't sleep much that night. Neither did Jin Woo, though for entirely different reasons. He sat in his office long after the gala ended, staring at the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows, replaying the confrontation, convincing himself he'd been right to suspend her, convincing himself that discipline mattered more than optics. That leadership required firmness, even when it looked harsh from the outside. He drafted a memo justifying the decision to the board, citing insubordination, citing conduct unbecoming of a senior executive. He didn't mention the janitor at all. In his retelling, the water spill and the shouting simply disappeared, replaced by a clean, professional narrative about a valued executive who had lost control in a moment of stress. He had no idea what was coming the next morning. At exactly 9 o'clock, an emergency message went out to every senior employee at Han Global Technologies. All executives, department heads, and board members were required to appear in the 20th floor boardroom within the hour. No agenda was attached. No explanation was given. Rumors moved through the building faster than the elevators could carry people to the meeting. Some whispered it was about layoffs. Others guessed it involved a merger. A few, who had heard fragments of what happened at the gala, wondered quietly if it had something to do with Sarah's suspension, though nobody could imagine why that would warrant summoning the entire board. Jin Woo arrived early, composed, confident, dressed in a fresh suit as though the previous night had never happened. He took his usual seat at the head of the table, greeting board members with practiced charm, already rehearsing how he'd frame the previous night's events if anyone asked. At 9:45, the boardroom doors opened. Minho Park walked in. He was no longer wearing a janitor's uniform. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, the kind that fit like it had been made specifically for his frame because it had. His posture was different, straighter, unmistakably commanding. The posture of a man who had built an empire from nothing and had simply chosen, for 1 week, to set that authority aside. Every board member in the room rose to their feet almost simultaneously, the way people rise instinctively for someone whose presence demands it before their mind has even fully processed why. "Chairman Park," one of the older board members said, visibly stunned. "We weren't told you'd returned from Jeju." "I never went to Jeju," Minho said calmly, walking to the head of the table, where Jin Woo now sat frozen, the color draining from his face in real time. Jin Woo's mouth opened, then closed. "Uncle, I don't understand." "You will," Minho said. "Everyone will." He set a folder down on the table, thick with printed observations, dates, timestamps, names. "1 week ago, I applied for a night shift janitorial position at this company under a different name. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, whether the values printed on our lobby wall meant anything at all, or whether they were simply words we used to impress investors while treating each other like garbage behind closed doors." The room went completely silent. A few executives shifted uncomfortably, suddenly recalling small interactions from the past week they wished they could take back. "I watched people I trusted with leadership positions ignore, insult, and dismiss the very employees who kept this building running," Minho continued, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. I watched managers who preach compassionate leadership in meetings scream at delivery workers the moment they thought nobody important was watching. I watched a culture that has drifted so far from what I built this company on, I barely recognized it. He turned toward Jinwoo directly now, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. And last night, I watched my own nephew humiliate an elderly janitor in front of 40 investors over a splash of water on his shoes. Jinwoo's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Uncle, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Minho cut in, his voice sharp for the first time. "You didn't know because you never bothered to ask who I was. You saw a uniform, and to you, that uniform meant I was worth nothing. You didn't see a person. You saw an obstacle beneath your notice." He let that sentence sit in the silence of the room before continuing. "You inherited a seat at this table, Jinwoo. You inherited authority, resources, and a company built by people who understood that character matters more than credentials. But you never inherited leadership. Leadership isn't something you're handed. It's something you earn, moment by moment, in exactly the kind of situation you failed last night." Jinwoo said nothing. There was nothing left to say. "There was one person in that room last night," Minho continued, turning his attention to the rest of the board, "who didn't know I owned this company, who had no idea the janitor she was defending held any power at all. She stood up anyway, knowing it would cost her everything because it was the right thing to do." He paused. "That is exactly the kind of leadership this company needs. Not the kind that demands respect through fear, but the kind that earns it through integrity, even when nobody is watching, and even when there's nothing to gain." He looked around the table at faces that had gone quiet with something between shame and realization. "Effective immediately, Jinwoo Park is removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer of Han Global Technologies." A ripple of shock moved through the room, though few were truly surprised given everything they'd just heard. "He will remain on the board in a limited advisory capacity while he undergoes leadership retraining, if he chooses to accept it. That decision is his own." Jinwoo sat frozen, staring at the table, unable to meet his uncle's eyes. "Sarah Johnson," Minho continued, "is reinstated immediately and promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations and Culture, a newly created position that will oversee not just performance metrics, but how this company treats every single person who works within these walls, regardless of title." He closed the folder in front of him. This company will return to what it was built on. Humanity first isn't a slogan for our lobby wall. Starting today, it's a standard every single person in this room will be held to, myself included. The meeting ended shortly after. Executives filed out of the boardroom in near silence, many of them replaying their own small interactions from the past week, wondering how many times they'd walked past someone who deserved better without giving it a second thought. Sarah received the call 20 minutes later while sitting in her apartment, still uncertain whether she had a job to return to at all. When Minho's assistant explained everything, the founder's identity, the promotion, the reversal of her suspension, she sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute before finally speaking. "He was the janitor," she said quietly, more to herself than to the assistant on the phone. "Chairman Park has asked if you'd be willing to meet with him this afternoon," the assistant said. "He'd like to speak with you personally." Sarah arrived at Han Global Technologies 2 hours later, walking through the same glass lobby, past the same gold lettering that read, "Humanity First," feeling the words differently than she ever had before. Minho was waiting for her near his office, dressed in the same tailored suit from the boardroom, looking every bit the founder of one of Asia's largest technology companies. "I owe you an explanation," he said as she approached. "You owe me nothing," Sarah replied, still processing everything. "I would have done the same thing regardless of who you were." I know, Minho said, a small smile crossing his face for the first time in days. That's exactly why I asked you here. He gestured for her to sit, and for the next hour, he explained everything. The growing distance he'd felt from his own company, the reports he no longer trusted, the decision to disappear into a role nobody would suspect, and everything he'd witnessed during his week undercover. You were the only person who treated me like I mattered without knowing there was anything to gain from it, he said. That told me more about your character than any performance review ever could. Sarah listened quietly, still, absorbing the weight of everything that had happened in the past 18 hours. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to say anything, Minho replied. You already showed me exactly who you are. Now I'm simply giving this company the chance to be led by someone who understands what actually matters. If this story has your full attention right now, take a second to drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. It genuinely helps this story reach more people. And we're almost at the ending. The weeks that followed transformed Han Global Technologies in ways nobody expected. Sarah's new role gave her direct authority over training programs, workplace policy, and a completely redesigned employee feedback system that allowed support staff, janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, delivery personnel to report mistreatment without fear of retaliation. She implemented mandatory leadership training focused on empathy and accountability, something several executives grumbled about privately, but none dared oppose publicly, not after what had happened to Jin Woo. Jin Woo himself disappeared from the company for several weeks, humiliated by the very culture he'd once dismissed as unnecessary. When he finally returned, quietly, without fanfare, he approached the retraining program his uncle had offered. And though it took time, something in him began to shift. He started saying good morning to the security guards. He started remembering the names of the people who cleaned his office floor. It wasn't overnight, and it wasn't complete, but it was a beginning. And Minho watched it unfold from a distance, choosing to give his nephew the same chance for growth that he'd once hoped the entire company would embrace. Employees who had once walked past the janitorial staff without a glance began learning names, offering thanks, treating the people who kept the building running with the basic dignity they'd always deserved. The change wasn't instant or universal, but it was real, spreading slowly through departments the way genuine culture shifts always do. Not through mandates alone, but through people watching each other and deciding, one interaction at a time, to be better than they'd been the day before. 1 month later, Minho stood in the same glass lobby where everything had unraveled and been rebuilt, unveiling a new plaque beneath the company's original motto. Employees gathered around, along with a handful of reporters who had caught wind of the story that was quickly becoming legend inside Seoul's business community. The founder who became a janitor for a week, and the American executive who stood up for a stranger without knowing who he really was. The plaque read simply, "Character is not measured by how we treat those above us, but by how we treat those we believe have nothing to offer us." Sarah stood near the front of the small crowd, watching Minho speak about the company's renewed commitment to the values it had always claimed to hold. When he finished, he found her in the crowd and gave her a small, knowing nod, the kind two people share when they've been through something together that words can't fully capture. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and the lobby returned to its usual rhythm of employees moving between meetings, Sarah walked past the reception desk and greeted the security guard by name, the same way she always had. A new janitor, hired to replace the position Minho had briefly occupied, nodded politely as she passed, and Sarah stopped, introduced herself properly, and asked about his day. It was a small moment. It always had been. But small moments Sarah had come to understand more deeply than ever were exactly where the truth of a person and the truth of a company lived. Minho watched her from across the lobby, remembering the words his son had once told him, words he wished he'd listened to sooner. A company's soul lives in how it treats the people nobody is watching. He finally understood exactly what that meant. And because one woman had refused to look away, an entire company had finally learned it too.